Hi. Hi, I'm Yi-Ling. I graduated in 2013, so quite a while ago. And I'm going to talk about how, when I was 7, my mom gifted me my very first diary. So this was more than 10 years ago, 16 years ago now. And last weekend, I flew back to Hong Kong from Beijing, and I decided that I wanted to go through all of my old diaries, and I dug this one up. Here it is. It's hand-bound. There's this beautiful painted elephant cover. The pages are made of this like thick parchment. And I remember when my mom gave it to me, I was thrilled. 7-year-old me was elated because, you know, beautiful books like these, they belonged on the shelves of libraries, and they were filled with important words written by important people, you know, movers and shakers who had something to say and something important to say. And when Mom gave me this diary, she was saying, you know, Ling, your story is worth figuring out, worth knowing, worth sharing. And so I started to write. And here's an idea. I started rooting through this about, you know, some of the things that I was starting to write. Okay, so I wrote about my experiences. In case you can't read my very neat handwriting, I'll read it out for you. It was my last day of school. We had a party, and children brought in food to eat. I stuffed myself with chocolate chips and popcorn. Some children brought in kebabs. I ate the sausages only. As I picked out the pineapples, I didn't favor them. My friend Florence was also picking out the pineapples. So really, you know, like riveting, important presidential stuff, you know, being chronicled in my early diary entries. I also wrote about friendships, you know, interpersonal relations. So here's an example, in case you can't read. I wrote about my best friend, Jasmine Wong. We're not best friends anymore, but we're friendly. I wrote, best friend dash Jasmine Wong. She sometimes is very nice to you, but never admits the things she doesn't know. And then one thing that I like to do was I would go back and write addendums, so like footnotes to my previous entries. I was already kind of editing my diary back then. And I added this in 2005. I think she pissed me off somehow, but that was there. So young Ling was very brutal about how she related to others. But even then, she was analyzing about, you know, her relationships and her friendships. I also wrote about my dreams, my aspirations, and what I wanted to become. And so here's an excerpt, which I'll read out to you. When I was really small, I wanted to be a ballerina. Then I wanted to be a policewoman. Then I wanted to be an astronaut. But because I watched a movie called Red Planet, which showed lots of astronauts dying in space, so I changed my mind into a storyteller. Then I was old enough to realize a storyteller didn't earn much money, and I could put my mind bursting with imagination on paper, so I decided to be a writer. So I wrote lots of stories, wrong spelling of stories, and my writing became better and better. And so that's essentially what I kept doing since then. I kept writing stories. I kept on writing in my diary. I still identify as a writer / many other things. I am a / person too. Here is a stack of moleskins, a little sleeker, you know, more minimalist than my fancy elephant journal, that I've kept since then. And so last weekend, I basically went through all of them. I felt almost like a historian or an architect, not an architect, an archaeologist, going on a dig, kind of excavating the artifacts of my past. And you know, this time I was trying to make sense of history, I was trying to make sense of a story, but rather narcissistically, that story was my own. And as I progressed through this stack, I found that as I grew older, and as the world around me and my surroundings became a little more complex, the ideas being written in these diaries also became more complex. They were still kind of the same. I was still writing about experiences, but also about how I felt about them, right? I was still writing about friends and how they were losers, but also the process of making new ones and the difficulty and the emotional tumult of losing old ones that mattered to me. I also wrote that I wanted to be a writer, but also what type of writer I wanted to become. And so I found an entry from 2013. So as I was graduating from CIS, same age as some of you guys here. And this was in response to an email exchange that I had with an English teacher at the time who was really meaningful to me and would offer me a lot of criticism. We had this constant dialogue and conversation going on in year 13. And I'll read a little bit of it. So in response, it might not make a lot of sense, but I'll just read it out. It's in response to some criticisms that he said of me, criticisms and advice. He said some important things, the dynamic of the insider and outsider. He essentially breathed words into everything I've been grappling with the last year. The necessity of compromise and diplomacy, and yet the dangers of corrupting integrity in such an approach. The divided life of the activist and the writer. I always knew that I wanted to write, but do I? Can I be content just being an observer, putting so much effort and concentration and just watching things happen, in reflection instead of action, or can I do both? And as a writer, there is too that insider-outsider complex. Can I be like Carraway? Nick Carraway, who's the protagonist of The Great Gatsby, for any of you guys who've read The Great Gatsby, both within and without feeling like a hypocrite? Can I be part of a rich, materialistic, elitist Hong Kong culture and write about it critically? SHIT in my own pool. So these were some of the ideas that I was grappling as a year 13 student. Honestly, not much different from, and then I wanted to be an astronaut, and then I wanted to be a storyteller. It was all me just trying to figure out who I wanted to become, just at a slightly increased level of complexity 10 years later. Okay, fast forward to my senior year of college. I took a life-changing seminar called The Theory and Practice of American Education. It sounds pretty boring, but honestly, life-changing in that it introduced a term to me that I realized is part of developmental psychology, particularly for adolescents. And the term I learned was exactly that particular skill that I've been developing by writing in my diary all these years, which is self-authorship. Okay. So, what is self-authorship? Okay, according to education scholar Robert Keegan, self-authorship, I may have edited a little for concision, so not direct quote, but self-authorship is an internal personal identity that invents values, convictions, ideals, and interpersonal loyalties. The two key words that I want to flag are identity and internal. So what do I mean by identity? It's, in other words, a process of articulating and answering and figuring out answers to these questions. Just listed out a couple that have been plaguing my mind since the dawn of time. But who am I? Where is home and where do I belong? What do I believe in? Who are my friends and family? What gives me joy, pain, anxiety? Where am I going? These are all questions crucial to shaping one's identity. Internal. This self is internally constructed. So as a person, when you develop self-authorship, you shift on depending on external values and beliefs to internal ones. What do I mean by that? I've given some examples here. So an example of an externally constructed identity is, I want to become a doctor because my parents think it'll be a good idea. Your parents are telling you something, you potentially internalize that, but essentially it is something that is given to you from without, right? The internally constructed identity version of that is still the same thing. You still want to be a doctor, but it comes from some kind of internal driver motivation. In this case, X wants to become a doctor because he or she is fascinated by the human anatomy. Place and belonging. Externally constructed identity. I am a Hong Konger because my passport says so. A document, a piece of paper tells you, you are a Hong Konger. And that, for me, was the longest time of how I conceived my own identity. My passport says I'm a Hong Konger, therefore I'm a Hong Konger. By the time I get to year 13, I'm like, am I a Hong Konger? My Cantonese is kind of Mama Dai, right? And like, And do I really feel like this sense of belonging and rootedness to this city when I'm kind of divorced from local culture? These are things that I started to think about. I love Harry Potter, so I'm going to throw in this last example. But an externally constructed identity, J.K. Rowling, like get your identity right, is I am a Hufflepuff because the Sorting Hat placed me there. They had no agency in which house they were going to belong. Now imagine if, who's in Hufflepuff? Okay, imagine if instead of being sorted into Hufflepuff, you were like, Cedric Diggory really embodies some of the communal values that I believe in. Therefore, I want to be in Hufflepuff. That is internally constructed identity. We don't need a sorting hat. Okay. Here's a blank image of a slide. Okay. Some of the images have disappeared, but imagine on this slide, there is a pottery wheel. Does anyone here do pottery or know what it looks like? It's like the potter kind of is like molding this piece of clay. I'm going to demonstrate because there's no image. And the wheel is going around and around and around, and your fingers are just kind of molding the shape of it. And I like to think of the process of developing self-authorship as a potter at the pottery wheel, right? So most of your K through 12 education growing up, the hands shaping the wheel are those external surroundings. So your parents, your school environment, your peers, your immediate environment, right? And I think for me, the transition between no self-authorship to self-authorship is when you become the hand molding the wheels, when you have the agency to shape the shape of the pot and who you're going to become. Now, this demand to know oneself and to shape oneself and to author oneself is nothing new. It's been a demand that's been around since the dawn of time. Another missing image, but imagine the Temple of Apollo at Delphi right here. I can't mime that, but you have vivid imaginations. And there's an inscription literally on that temple that says, "Know thyself." And then Socrates saw it and he was like, I'm going to tell all my students that. And then Plato was like, okay, I'm going to tell my students that. And Lao Tzu was also like, know thyself, guys. So it's been around for the dawn of time. But what I want to emphasize is that the ability to know thyself or know oneself is actually more important than ever before. More important than it was for our parents, and actually crucial to the survival of our generation in the 21st century. Let me explain why. So, the first presentation actually touched on this a little bit. We are entering an age of change and uncertainty, which means we don't know what people will be doing for a living in the next 10 years. We don't know how armies or nations or bureaucracies will function. We don't know what gender relations will look like. We've been hearing a lot of hubbub about artificial intelligence, right? And one big consequence of artificial intelligence is job displacement. I think we've been hearing a lot about that, which means, 10 years from now, 40% of jobs as we know it won't exist. So say you are a radiologist or a line chef or an accountant, your job will be automated. Machines will do them better. In our parents' generations, if you study to become a dentist or a doctor, you'll be a dentist or a doctor for the rest of your life, essentially. And you have a happy, stable identity as, hi, my name is Yi-Ling, and I'm a dentist. But in our generation, change and uncertainty will just throw that totally out of the window, throw that model of work out of the window. Okay, so there used to be three really cute images on this slide, but they're now gone. And so imagine three versions of Xiaoming. Okay, so here's Xiaoming in 2019. He's a cute little boy. He just looks like one of y'all. And he's a student of radiology and he's living in Hong Kong. 10 years later, in 2029, Xiaoming can't be like, hello, my name is Xiaoming, I'm a radiologist. He's going to need to be like, hi, my name is Xiaoming, I'm a freelance virtual reality consultant by day, / nurse by night, / maybe 50 other billion things that he does freelance, and moves between London and Beijing. 2069, I think I have a really good and vivid imagination, but it's really hard to predict what that will look like. But Xiaoming might identify as a brain data uploader who splits his time between the cloud and Mars' second ring road. And so that level of change is profoundly destabilizing. I have peers in my year group who are like, I am a consultant, and now I want to be XYZ, and I am so stressed about that because all my life I was like, I'm going to continue on this route working at Bain Capital for the next 10 years of my life. And so that idea of self-authorship, of continually rewriting your diary, going back to the wheel, shaping the person you're going to become, is almost like a great source of stability in that regard. And you know, in the future model of work, 2069, when you're 50, you'll still need to return again to the potter's wheel again and again to re-author your sense of self, who you are, what you believe in, where you want to go. No. Okay, more imagination, more invention that we have to do. I recently came across an article written by the writer Yuval Noah Harari. Has anyone read him? He's kind of like the darling of Silicon Valley, but he wrote this book called Homo Deus. And he also wrote an article for Wired magazine. And the title of the article is like, what all kids need to know by 2050. And Yuval, who's kind of like a godlike figure who's super wise, says, and therefore we should listen to him, no, you should think for yourself. But he says, the art of reinvention will be the most critical skill of this century. The art of reinvention. And he says, to keep up with the world of 2050, you will need to reinvent yourself again and again. And that to me is essentially what self-authorship is. The ability to say who I am, where I'm going, what I want to become, but to continually return to that, to return to the potter's wheel and be okay with editing the answers to that question. 5 years, every 10 years, every 2 years. Before I peace, I want to leave with this image. Okay, let me put you in the setting. This past summer, I was directing a summer camp out in the Berkshires in the United States. And imagine a big tannery, which is kind of like a chapel-like setting. And there are 30 high schoolers from all around the world. And every night, we have this evening ritual where we come together, and 5 high schoolers, for 5 minutes each, will share a story, a little piece of themselves that articulates exactly that, who they are, who they were, who they want to become. And we did this every night with a lantern, like in peace and quiet of the Berkshires in the United States. And to me, it was such a powerful experience, and one that I knew that I wanted to recreate wherever I went, because I realized that self-authorship fundamentally works best not when it happens alone, not when I'm alone with my elephant-covered diary and my moleskins, but when those stories are shared and when those identities are explored together collectively. And so in some ways, TEDx is like a little and wonderful, props to the organizers for doing this, opportunity to do that, right? You gave me a 10-minute slot to be like, yo, hi, my name is Yi-Ling. When I was 7, my mom gifted me a journal, and by giving me that gift, she said, hey, Ling, your story is worth knowing, it's worth figuring out, it's worth sharing, and I hope that, by sharing that story, I'm also giving you a little piece of that gift and saying, hey, guys, your story is worth knowing, worth figuring out, worth sharing, and actually might be crucial for our survival. So, thank you.